I'm going to try to give you a broader perspective, hopefully to close out the day of the presentations. I work on issues related to blockchain, not just in financial services, but across industries. And I want to talk about some of the fundamental conceptual interfaces between blockchain and law, which are very relevant to everything we've been talking about today. So, starting point, and this should be familiar for this audience, is take a bunch of tokens, and here I just put up here a 10-pound note, some shares of stock in a company, some theater tickets. What makes them valuable? They're just pieces of paper. Well, of course, they're tokens, and the value comes in the belief that they are representative of something, that you can have some level of confidence and expectation that you're entitled to something of value. And that implies a degree of trust. It implies either trust in some sort of institution, and that might be ultimately the British government standing behind the currency. That might be belief in some private set of institutions, whether that's the company or the exchange or something else. Or it might be some belief in the counterparty. So if someone walks up to you and says, I'll sell you these theater tickets for £400, you might want to know something about that person. Or you get an email saying it's from a Nigerian prince saying you need to wire some money somewhere. You might want to know who that person is before you have a degree of trust to engage in that transaction. And so the big question is whether it's possible to create trust without either belief in some institution or some sort of interpersonal relationship. And obviously we're here talking about blockchain because the answer is yes. And Bitcoin is a great existence proof for this fact. This is a slightly out-of-date chart. I don't know, some of you may be old enough to remember back when Bitcoin was only at 1,700 US dollars, about 2 weeks ago. But even if you abstract out the level of speculation, the bubble that seems to be going on in Bitcoin pricing, this is a 5-year chart, clearly over an extended period of time, a lot of sophisticated people around the world are willing to believe and act on a belief that this digital virtual currency, based on nothing but basically this paper put out by someone or some group of people in 2008, creates the foundations for treating that as something of value. So we have an existence proof. But the question is, well, what does that really mean? What is the nature of that trust that's being generated by the blockchain? And the interesting thing is this is happening at a time when trust is eroding all over the world. So you may not be able to read this. This is a quote from the Edelman Group, a major global public relations firm. They do a study of trust that they release every year at the World Economic Forum in Davos. They've been doing it since 2001. The trust study this year found that trust was eroding across the board. They'd never seen this before. Trust in government, trust in corporation, trust in NGOs, trust in the media, all dropping. And of course, I don't really need to tell you that. I'm here as an emissary from the land of Trump, coming here to the land of Brexit. We all know that there's something going on where trust is failing all throughout society, and yet people are willing to trust this seemingly crazy idea of a fully distributed blockchain. So what's going on? Fundamentally, there are two traditional mechanisms of generating trust in society, what I call trust architectures. The first one on the left here, you see the illustration from Thomas Hobbes' book Leviathan back in the 17th century. And Hobbes' argument was that in society, it's in the nature of the social contract, we cede power to the state. We give up, in his words, a monopoly on violence, the legitimate use of force, to the state. Not because we want to empower the state, but because we want to empower each other. Because we would not be able to reliably enter into private transactions, to contracts and other kinds of transactions, if we didn't have confidence that the counterparty would run away with the money, or that whoever had the most force would be the one who would win in that transaction. We give the state that power so that we trust the other party, that if something goes wrong in the transaction, then we can go into some governmental court system to resolve it. And more recently, thinkers from the Economic School of New Institutional Economics have extended that kind of model. It's not just about the government, it's about trusting institutions. So this is Douglas North, Nobel Prize winner in economics, economic historian, who talked about the nature of institutions throughout history, which include things like medieval guilds, but also the joint stock corporation and financial exchanges and so forth, which lower transaction costs. They allow, in a modern national and global society, us to engage in trusted transactions by virtue of having some centralized trust in the intermediary. So that's the central trust model, and you're going to see some diagrams here that look very much like the diagram you've seen many times today about centralized and decentralized networks, but it's important to understand what that's representing. So if you have a centralized ledger, ultimately you are trusting that you see the correct thing on your ledger because of what's in the center, because there's some master copy. And as we talked about, that creates a central point of failure, but it also facilitates lots of transactions and is an incredibly valuable way to promote trust in society. There is, though, a second mode of promoting trust. It's a little bit dark on the screen there, but on the right is Elinor Ostrom, also Nobel laureate in economics. And she and a number of other scholars articulated the kind of trust that emerges from networks of people building up from interpersonal relationships, shared norms, and governance mechanisms, trust around a common system. It's not always true that if there is a shared commons and there's not legal regulation, things like property rights enforced by law, that there's always a tragedy at the commons. It turns out in the real world that often doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen because there is interpersonal trust, because people build up trust with each other. Typically they're in communities that have some shared norms. And there are recourse mechanisms within that community. They may not be legal, formal recourse mechanisms, but ostracization from the community is a big enough threat that in lots and lots of scenarios around the world, it turns out if there are well-defined and working governance mechanisms, that promotes trust. But that's also a limited form of trust. It's not terribly scalable because, for one thing, it's not transitive. My trusting you doesn't necessarily mean I trust someone else. And it doesn't work terribly well once you get into a large, impersonal environment where you can't have parties that know each other. So there are limits to both those forms of trust. BlockChain produces a third trust architecture, which is sometimes called Trustless Trust. This was a term from Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn and a blockchain technology investor. And often we hear about blockchain as a trustless system, and that's not entirely accurate. Because what blockchain does is it means you don't have to trust any individual actor. You don't have to trust a particular party or a particular intermediary, but you have to trust the system as a whole. You have to have confidence that what you are seeing on your ledger is what everyone else is seeing on their ledger. And it turns out, as we've already talked about many times today, in a permission blockchain environment, even the idea that you don't trust anyone is relaxed. Because there's some identity and some permission to be able to run a node on the network. The consensus mechanisms, proof of work, or whatever protocol is used in the blockchain, serve the function of ensuring consistency and promoting that trust without central control. And they do that in a few different ways. One of them is just the nature of an immutable ledger. It's an append-only database. So it's not possible to go back and change or edit what's recorded on the ledger. No party in the network can do it. No government can do it. It's inherently an immutable record. But there's something beyond that structural fact. The Ethereum community talks about, they've invented this term called cryptoeconomics, which I think is a fairly useful way of describing what's going on. Blockchain technology is a fusion of cryptography, of the math that provides robust mathematical certainty around information, with economics and particularly game theory. It's a behavioral determination. The idea in a proof of work system and most of these other consensus mechanisms is essentially there's skin in the game. It's costly to cheat. We assume everyone's going to try to cheat, but you've got to throw so much computing power at it. Or so much voting stake at it in other kinds of consensus mechanisms that effectively you're not going to do so. So the combination of understanding human nature with understanding math is what makes this system trustworthy even without having to trust the individuals or an intermediary. And I'm sorry, it looks like this got cut off here when the font's translated. But the question was asked a few times, especially right before lunch, a very important question, which always needs to get asked with blockchain systems, of why do we need this? What are we doing with a distributed ledger that we couldn't just do with a traditional kind of database system? And many of the things that we see people applying blockchain to are things that don't necessarily require a blockchain. Well, there are two fundamental reasons why we might want to use this new trustless form of trust. One of them is there's some failure in the centralization. And part of that has to do with single points of failure, that it's a security risk when you're depending on any one entity that's going to be attacked or that's too empowered in the system. But there are a number of other reasons why that might be problematic. The initial impetus for Bitcoin was concern about the state. Was a libertarian view that there is an inherent problem in having state-issued fiat currency, and this came out of the financial crisis. That's one perspective, but it's not a necessary perspective to believe that there's flaws in having a central entity with too much power. A second case is where there isn't a functional rule of law, and this is not typically a problem in jurisdictions like the ones we're mostly talking about here. But there are many places in the world, and especially once you go beyond financial services to talk about things like land titles or humanitarian assistance and so forth, where the rule of law simply does not hold, and you can't depend on taking something into court and enforcing it in a legal system. So then a distributed trustless trust system might provide an alternative. But there are a number of other situations, even if we don't assume that, where this makes a lot of sense. Many situations that involve too much fragmentation or too much border crossing. So it's simply not possible to put everything on one centralized system. We've heard just now about international kinds of issues and lots of difficulties in mapping any kind of system across borders. We have different legal systems. This is particularly true in one of the other major application classes for blockchain, which is supply chain applications. Companies managing global supply chains, they have relationships with providers and intermediaries all throughout the world, and it's simply not feasible, even for very large global multinational companies, to say everyone in the world needs to get on our one platform. Part of that is the fragmentation, but part of that is the fact that as you spread these networks, you tend to get situations where you have, for example, multiple competitors on the same network. And those competitors are not wanting to give up control to each other. They don't want their competitor to be the one running the network. They want to have some situation where they're not foregoing that level of control, but not necessarily foregoing the control to one central intermediary, which then has its own power. Or there are situations where simply having one party in the middle, simply giving essentially monopoly powers, the question was asked at the end of the last panel, giving monopoly power to any intermediary necessarily causes it to behave like a monopolist. And economic theory tells you that once you have a monopolist, innovation tends to slow down. It's not in their interest to promote innovation and necessarily, in many cases, efficiency of the marketplace, because they want to preserve their own position. And that's not anything inherently evil. It's just in the nature of their role within the ecosystem. So the possibility of getting away from that centralized power to something distributed can overcome that. The second dimension is that there are situations where having one platform creates inherent efficiencies. And we've heard a lot about this already. Having a system where you don't have to do settlement or reconciliation potentially leads to efficiency, avoids possibility of errors, and creates situations where there can be a limitation of the delay involved. In addition, the possibility of having one platform allows more easily for automation in the form of smart contracts. Of course, it's possible to do a smart contract without some kind of standardized or ledger system, but it's much easier to run code across a common substrate. So having one distributed ledger platform that all the transactions are on facilitates the benefits of automation through smart contracts. And finally, it allows for visibility. Which can allow the parties in the network to audit the system or potentially allow regulators to audit the system. So the kinds of applications that can benefit from any of these different advantages are the ones where distributed ledger makes sense and where traditional database technology can't necessarily provide the same advantages. So what does this mean for law? I'm a legal scholar and coming at this thinking about, well, is there still a role for lawyers and for the legal system, and it turns out that there is. The first point to make here, we've heard the invocation of Lawrence Lessig's famous concept that code is law. Lessig, I always feel the need to defend Larry, he's a friend of mine, but Lessig was not saying code eliminates law, code substitutes for law, code makes law irrelevant. Lessig was saying code can act as another form of law. And by the way, he also said markets and norms can also act as a form of law. And we need to compare these different governance or regulatory structures because they all have advantages and disadvantages. There's some real benefits of the law which are preferable to code as a regulator. One of the more obvious ones is the rigidity of code, the kinds of issues that we heard in the smart contracts discussion, that computers are not necessarily smart enough to be adaptable in the way that humans can be, but there are certain advantages of using computer code over law. The key in understanding blockchain is that blockchain is a kind of governance institution. So there's a whole set of issues about regulating blockchains and regulating blockchain transactions. But the key is how do the blockchains actually execute and fulfill a governance role? And it turns out, again, even though this is theoretically a trustless system, you have to trust the code and the developers of that code. And you have to trust, to some degree, collectively, the verification nodes. And that can break down. So the example of the DAO last year, this distributed crowdfunding platform built on Ethereum that was hacked. And the Ethereum network wasn't hacked. The security was intact in Ethereum. Someone figured out an exploit to run a smart contract that was a valid smart contract. But the smart contract essentially transferred a third of the ether in the DAO, at that time about $60 million, now it'll be worth about $800 million at current prices, into their own private account. And the point is, from the perspective of the system, perfectly legitimate transaction. The computers had no way to understand intent. Any human looking at that said, that's a thief. We know what they're doing, they are stealing. It was transparently obvious. But the system, the technology, couldn't understand that. And so Ethereum then had to hard fork, ultimately, the entire Ethereum platform in order to unwind those transactions. So we always wind up running into this question of subjectivity and intent, which is the things that humans are much better at than computers. And fundamentally what we're looking at here is the value of some sort of post hoc system. Putting trust in a blockchain pushes a lot of the activity to the ex ante process. We've got to specify out ahead of time what's going on in this smart contract. Or we're moving from more of a settlement kind of system to a bearer system where potentially at the limit we've got to pre-fund all the trades. And there may be advantages to that, but there's significant disadvantages to that. And inherently, there's uncertainty about the future. The literature on contract law talks about contracts being incomplete. There's no way in the vast majority of situations to write a contract that takes into account every eventuality. Turns out real world contracts, legal contracts, are much simpler than pure economic theory might suggest because we can anticipate at the end of the process, post hoc, there is a system of legal resolution that can be brought into play. And so that's why we need some of the mechanisms like we heard about from Lee Brain earlier that hybridize the post hoc resolution systems of the law with the kind of ex ante systems of the blockchain. And ultimately the question is going to be what the right balance is, and then I'll wind up. There are three fundamental ways that law and blockchain can interact. Most of what we're talking about here is in the first category, situations where the legal system is basically functional, but we can massively improve efficiency and other benefits by using distributed ledger technologies, but there's a bunch of hard problems to work through on how to map the existing legal regimes onto the new technology. The next two categories are more speculative but more significant, in particular outside of financial services, situations where there's a gap in the legal system, where the legal system doesn't work particularly well. We have this a lot in cases of intellectual property and lots of other legal processes where they're just not terribly effective, and blockchain can potentially fill in the gap. And then at the other end, there are situations where there isn't a functioning legal system, and most of these today are situations like the developing world where there isn't predominantly a rule of law, but there's a broader scope of situations where law does not go today, and those are the situations where blockchain potentially can fill in the gaps. So I'll leave you with a final quote from Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce.com. He says the digital revolution, which is of course what's transformed the world over the past few decades, needs something else. What it needs is a trust revolution. And blockchain potentially provides that, but only if we're willing to implement it in a way that understands the meaning of trust and what's necessary to effectuate it. Thanks very much.